I'm sure that most of you Robert E. Howard scholars will know, but Robert E. Howard was actually employed by the newspaper somewhere about 1925. He was employed to write oil news. So he would actually go out on the field and get all the particular information about what depth they were drilling, and all the different detailed things about that particular oil site that he was at. He wasn't happy about it. It wasn't his calling, but he did it. He got paid $5 per column. So Arlene is sure that Robert's DNA is still here lingering within the building, and she may very well be correct, because I'm not a cleaner and we haven't updated any. So welcome, and y'all come on in. This is Jack Baum, and I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to
Do you have
him.
anything you want to say?
No, Jack.
Oh, welcome. I did work for the Review back. They came to me at the first week or second week of my 6th grade year. They'd actually gone to my dad first and said, we'd like to offer Jack the job to become printer's devil down here and be a printer's apprentice at the Review, and would you mind me asking him? And so he said, sure. I think it'd be a great opportunity for him. And so they came and asked me if I'd like to have a job down here, and they told me I'd be required to come in after school at 3 o'clock, and we'd work till 7 or 9 every night, and and they'd teach me all about what it took to print a newspaper. And I thought, sure. And Mother says, why would they want him? Said, he doesn't know anything, and she was trying to talk Daddy out of letting me do it. But anyway, I took the job, and for 1 year, until football season started the next September, and I wanted to play football, and so they wouldn't let me, play football. I couldn't play football because it's too time intensive down here. And during the summer, we'd work full time. I worked full time. I made $17.50 a week working, all day Saturday, and from 3 o'clock till usually on average I'd get off by 8, at night, and during the school year. And then I worked 8 hours a day, 6 days a week during the summer, and 12 years old. But what we did, I want to tell you the experience I had down here, but I also want to tell you that, I learned a lot, and I told somebody yesterday, I don't remember who it was, it probably learned more in that 1 year, of valuable life experiences than I had the rest of my life, put together almost. So it's a very, very worthwhile experience. I want to tell you a little bit about how the paper was put together, and I'm just going to try to walk through day by day what we did each day of the week to get the paper printed. We were pretty well a 4-man operation here back that year. Jack McCarty owned the paper, and he spent most of his days going out around town and collecting news, asking people what interesting was going on, and come back and write up the news. He would then come in, and he and his son Danny, who was a junior in high school at that time, who recruited me, Danny would go around and collect more news around town and sell ads, and both of them would sell ads. So most of their work they did were right here in this front office and outside. They had here and outside. And then Benny Glover, whose picture is over here on the wall, the young man in the middle there who wound up owning the paper years later, he was a senior in high school at that time, and he and I would put the paper together. So that's how it started. Jack and them come down, they start typing up the stories and everything here. They'd hand them off, then if you'll come on back here. And by the way, has anybody worked in newspaper, on a newspaper before?
Yeah, but not in the.
Well, get it to printing.
Well, yeah, graphic design and stuff to get it ready to print. Yeah.
And back in.
Back before computers.
Okay. Well, now if I say anything that's not right, please correct me, because I'm going off information that I remember as a 12-year-old kid. So, and as Rusty loves to point out, he loves to point out that I embellish everything I say. So, and some of those that you know me around here, look at, see, you got a response over there, didn't you? Yeah, they hear me embellishing quite often at different places. But anyway, so don't correct me, because what I'm telling you is how I remember it. And so, you know, I think there'll be some value in it, but I don't know how much. Also, you know, just, I may get the cough, and if I do, just put up with me, because Barbara's been sick, she's giving it to me. But anyway, we take the print, you know, the articles and everything that we'd get, and the handwritten articles, and the type itself, we'd come back here to the linotype. Now this linotype was created, the first ones were created in the early 1900s. And that was when really everything was hand written, or not handwritten, hand set back until that time. And we still hand set a lot of the paper back in my time in 1958. But back then, this really revolutionized the printed word, because what they were able to do, they'd take a piece of print newspaper, and they'd come in here and he'd type out a line, and he'd get the line spaced. And what it would do when he typed the line, it'd take these letters, these metal letters, and it'd drop them in a tray. And that tray then would be a column, you know, one line on a column, you know, of print. And he had to get that spacing right. And what would happen then, we had over here on the other side was a pot that was, I don't know what temperature it heated the metal up to, but we had lead blocks about that size and about that wide. And Benny did most of the linotype. Danny did some of it, but Benny did most of the linotype. And he'd say, "Okay, Jack," he didn't want to get up and have to put his own bricks into the fire. And so I'd go over there, and you had to drop them just so carefully, because that, you know, it'd melt that lead instantly, and it'd splatter all over you. And we used to have lead all over everything back here, where it splattered, you know, where somebody dropped it in too quick and it splattered. It's dangerous stuff. I mean, you could put an eye out real easy if you got some of that hot lead. But they didn't mind if I lost my eyes at 12 years old, you know. I mean, they could replace me pretty easy. So they came in here, and that's, you know, one job I had to do. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I just noticed the windows there. Were the windows there so that for the ventilation for the lead, or?
No, they didn't care anything. That was way before ventilation was important. What did it matter if your lungs don't function later on in life, you know? That wasn't part of the issue. But anyway, they were really good. It's amazing how many lines they could set. Now this is a 1922 model, and that goes right at the time when the newspaper changed hands, and it went to the ownership of Tom Bryant. And Tom Bryant and two other men they were oil men, and at that time they were pretty successful oil men. And so I'm sure they're the ones that came up with the money to bring this first linotype in here and to really change how things went. But anyway, the written word, this is where it happened, you know, where most of your newsprint came from, was from this machine right here, coming in from the front door there. Then, after that, we had these tables right here were set in the middle of the room right here. And they were back to back to one another. And these are marble blocks. And this is where we this is where we made the paper. This is where we made the paper. So what happened, we printed the paper on Tuesday night, and sometime it didn't get finished until 5 or 6 o'clock on Wednesday morning, because it had to go to the mail just, you know, Wednesday morning to get in everybody's mailbox and get sent out across the country. And so everything had to end, you know, before the mail went out on Wednesday morning. So we would come back here, and we'd be putting the paper all together, and then Wednesday afternoon we'd tear it down. But when we'd start, we'd come back here, and we'd have pretty well an idea of what's going in. I'd be building ads by hand all week long. And the way we'd build ads, we'd come over here and we had print cases. And as I remember it, we had 4 print cases, 4 of these print cases right here, and we'd have that have, each one have a drawer in it. And each one of them had a different typeset in it, which was just like the typeset that you have on your computer today. Gothic, you know, Arial, all those. We had all those set here, but they were set in, and we don't have any copies of those letters. But anyway, they were just raised letters, you know, that you set in a tray, and I take over there and I start putting the paper together. Now the first thing I do every week is I take all the ads that was, you know, building, and Benny and I would build by hand the ads for the most part that would go into the paper. In other words, we would take, well, there's no ads on these right here, but we'd take an ad like this ad right here, you know, without the pictures, because most of our ads didn't have pictures with them. Now we did have, and I'll show you some examples of, but we'd take an ad like this, say that just said, you know, Cox Groceries, for instance, and it'd have groceries, and it'd have a list of their specials down the side. So we'd go in and set by hand every item in that, and we'd organize it. I mean, and at 12 years old, they had me organizing the layout of the ads. In other words, you'd sit here and you decide that, well, you needed this heading, and this would catch somebody's attention. Then you get down and you might have some important print that was kind of small, I mean, that was important, but you might put it small to, you know, and get a grabber down there and make them go back and read it rather than just pass over it. So we used all kind of marketing tricks back then to try to get down and, you know, to sell the products we're selling. But at 12 years old, Benny and I would set up, well, here's a pretty good ad. Just, you know, we'd set up something like that was just, you know, or like this, that didn't have any artwork to it or anything. We set and that's the majority of it. Now, Hickenbothams, you know, if they had routine things that print, or if they want how much money they want to spend, we would put together kind of layouts like this, and then we'd take a picture of it and send this off to Abilene and they would print up a block like this, come back, and this would make an ad. Now this was really easy to set in there somewhere, but we didn't have many people that wanted to spend the money that it'd take on an ad to have this technology work. But we have a bunch of those you'll see back in the back still around, and here's some. And it brings up another point. When you're 12 years old and you learn to read backwards, you know, it's really a good mind exercise. It really works the other side of your brain. And it really came in handy when I became a dentist and was practicing dentistry, because I could sit there and use a mirror, and if you've ever looked at anything in a mirror, it's reverse of what it is. Well, your mind's looking at something, and if you're not ever able to reverse that in that mirror, you're going to drill on the wrong tooth or get off worse yet in a tongue or something like that. So my experience here helped me because I was already accustomed to reading backwards, and I didn't have to learn it like so many of the guys and gals did in dental school. That's just a side. That doesn't have anything to do with the prep business. But anyway, so we'd sit there, we'd set up the ads, and then what we'd do, we had a roller that had ink on it, and we just rolled it across the ads. We'd block them down where everything was good and tight, you know, and we'd roll across the ad, and then we'd take it and we'd run out to Danny and them say, okay, run this down to the business and see if this, you know, let them proof the ad, see if they agree with it, if they have any changes made, then they'd come back and make the change. And so we went through that through Saturday pretty well. We'd tear down and put together, tear down, put together. And all the time they were printing, you know, out the printed word that went over here. I was designing ads. I was laying out on these turned around, I was laying out all 8 pages of like this going page 1. And they pretty well, by mid-year, they pretty well allowed me to lay out the paper. Now they'd come and adjust it, and every once in a while I'd get chewed out to no end because I hadn't, you know, something didn't make a lot of sense the way it's laid out. But we'd lay out the paper across here, and we'd take the print and we'd lay it in there, and you got pretty good where you could estimate, you know, the size, and then we'd go back, and if something wasn't fit, we'd have to go back and retype, you know, to cut it down and edit it. A lot of the editing was done because of the space we had to put things in, rather than trying to clean up the printed word a little bit. So we'd do that, we'd lay it all out, and this stuff was, well, let me show you over here. These are some examples of what the printed word looked like. And you can come rub your hand over here and you can see just how rough and everything that was. But I mean, this is an actual line of type, something that has to do with George. And you can see how reading upside down. Well, I'd have to read and proof, and if I found anything, they wouldn't give me the proof. When I was making up the paper, I had to read the whole column as I was setting it in there to make sure I was setting it in right, and read it upside down. And if I saw something wrong, I'd say, Benny, you need to look at this, and go back, and it's just a continual process of re-editing the thing as we went. But you can come over and feel this, and we put spaces, and we'd use different spacers in between some things, especially in setting up the ads, but also within the type. We'd slip in a little space here and there so it tighten it up, because the worst thing you could ever happen is you get all your type set up over there, you spend 3 or 4 days getting the newspaper laid out, you pick it up off that block over there, and it doesn't have a back on it. It's just squeezed in with, you screw down tight screws in it with blocks on the side to tighten everything up to move over here to print it. And the last thing you want to do was for all your paper to wind up on the floor. So, all that work. So then you really were in a mess. And that happened to me. And that was the one time when there was no mercy. I had to stay up all one night to reset one page that I dropped on the way over here. And they didn't care school or nothing when it came to that. When it's that serious, you got it out, So anyway, that another learning experience to check your work and everything before you get there. But we'd come over here, and then we would run. It had to set flat. All that type had to set flat over here, and you'd set it flat, and we had a mallet, and I'd tap it down where everything was smooth and lined out so that it would print, a good quality page. And then once we set, we'd take 2 of the pages over here and set it on this printing press. And you can see the wheels here. We had a pulley because we didn't have electric motors, or they had a pulley. We did have electric motors by the time I got here, but I mean there were still belts and everything that ran through this infrastructure, where they'd run gas engines, to run the printing press. But I stood on the platform here, and we'd have pages, laid up that fill up this whole thing, that lay up across here, and that, you'd usually stack up about this many pages on here. And I'd sit up here, and this thing be running, these gears right here below you. We had no guards on it. Be running, and I'd sit here and I'd flip up the page, and it'd come down, it'd line up right here, and the timing, it's kind of like a dance. You just had to get your timing down where you'd flip, you'd move the page, and it'd come in here, and it'd go in a circle, and it'd come out and spit it out down below. Our plates were sitting here, and then the cycle, they'd pick up on these rollers here, on these rubber rollers, they'd pick up ink, they'd pick up ink here, and the whole process is just, it was all governed by the size of this wheel right here. And it turned this big cylinder here where I'd place the paper right here, and it'd release onto it and go around as the ink was being refurbished on the print. And it'd come around and it'd spit it out down here. And you'd go about that, and and everything was precious. Yes, sir.
I just can't help but ask, did anyone ever get caught up in those gears?
It was one of the most dangerous places to work. It's almost as bad as working on a drilling rig in the oil business.
It looks bad.
And I worked on drilling rigs in the oil business. I'll show you a machine back here that many people lost their fingers on in a minute. But I never did get caught up here, and I don't know why, because it'd been so easy to do. But that's one reason, they picked. I mean, I was kind of known as I followed directions, and everything, and they, and so when you start out in 6th grade, that's kind of what, they wanted somebody. But Benny and we'd run this, I'd run it till I got tired, and then Benny'd run it till he got tired, and if Danny was around one playing, being the owner's son, he had liberties that Benny and I didn't have, and so he'd be running around. I learned a lot of bad things from Danny, with Cardi, by the way. But anyway, we'd sit there and run that, because we had to get it, and this was usually, you were down to Wednesday night, Tuesday night, and you was running this thing, and it had to go right. You didn't have, because it taken all week to get this thing together, and you had to get it out. And then the real pain in the rear was this machine right here. This was our folding machine. And if there's ever anything that happened that caused us not to get the paper out, it was this darn machine right here. Because then you had to start folding by hand, and folding an 8-page paper by hand wasn't an easy thing to do. And this would cut it, and it wasn't, it was a mess. But Danny, that's one thing Danny was good for. He could usually fix this stupid machine in time for us to get it out.
Was the paper, was it cut in specific sizes when it would be shipped in?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, we had big flat
big
boxes.
pallets.
Yeah, and and that's one thing I've been trying to reconcile in my mind. I did some research, just to try to make, and it said 2 pages at a time. I remember us running 4 pages at a time and running it through here, and it cut and fold, but I'm probably wrong on that. But I don't remember it 2 pages at a time. I remember us we'd run one side with 4 pages, turn it over, run the other side 4 pages, and then this machine would kind of sort it all out. And I never did understand how this sucker was that
Did all
smart.
that.
Yeah. But I could be wrong there. That's just how I remember it. Does anybody else have a different
That sounds right.
Yeah, well, you read this, and that doesn't sound like that's the way it operated. Oh, another interesting thing. All these things were the first piece of equipment they usually bought, were these presses. Yeah, these Babcock presses. And this is the floor is built around this. The building was built around this press. They set the press in place, and then they built the building. And you read about it, and most all of them, that's what it was, because these things were heavy, it's hard to get in, they had to be stabilized totally. They didn't want them on wood, and so they built this building around the machine. When I had spare time, and Benny had spare time, and Danny had spare time, we'd go back and we'd print leaflets. A lot of the grocery stores and everything would like to hand out a special, leaflet. And so we'd print those up by hand back here on the hand press that you'll see in just a minute. And then we would also go and we'd print letterheads for almost all the businesses. Well, all the businesses that had a printed letterhead, we printed the letterhead for them. And we also printed the envelopes for that, put that letterhead in. So, they'd want different size of ads and everything. So we'd print them out, and then we'd come in here and get everything the right size. We'd expand this, roll this in to get the exact right size, that we want to cut, and then Todd, stick your hand right there.
No.
So big as I.
Yeah. Anyway, then it really wasn't that dangerous because you can stay away from this. Now, don't anybody get down there, but see, you use this, and you can cut a lot of paper with the leverage that you got from this. So we'd bring it, our print work from back there, and we'd cut it down to size here. And sometimes, it just was used for trimming up things. We'd have a pile of scrap paper, laying under here where we'd do all the shavings. This machine right here, you saw that ad that was printed. I think this came along after I was here.
Yeah, I brought it down.
Did you bring it down? Well, tell us what this thing does.
Well, it's
Camera.
the camera that shoots the negatives, just like the way that old cameras used to take the little film and you would develop your pictures. Well, that's what we still do with the paper. In fact, a lot of newspapers have gone to where they don't have negatives anymore. They go directly from the computer to a plate, and then they go to the press. Whereas we still have a camera like this over there at Clyde, and we brought this one over here because Cross Plains was doing their own negatives, and then they would bring them down, and then we'd print them. But we got to where it was much easier just to have one dark room and one place to make the negatives. And the negatives are not like those negatives that are in there next to that plate. It's clipped to that aluminum plate. That's what we still do over at Clyde. It's just that when we brought this one down, we were using it, but we don't use it anymore. So.
And the dark room was back there.
Yeah.
There's not a light in there.
Yeah,
so-
no, the dark room's back there, and I don't know if most of you, or a lot of you know Susan Glover. And Susan's uncle, Joe McNeil, was our main photographer, and he would do the, photography back here, and Danny did a lot of it too. And quite honestly, I saw things come out of that dark room that I probably shouldn't have seen as a 12-year-old. But anyway, that's just a little sidelight, That's one of the reasons I'm kind of weird like I am, that's what went on in that dark room. This is the most dangerous place in the newspaper office. And literally, you didn't work in a newspaper very long unless you're just very skilled without losing a finger to this machine right here. And this is where we did our small job printing. In other words, we had a larger one here.
It's over at Clyde.
Okay, but it's about twice this size,
Yeah,
wasn't
it's
it?
twice that size.
Yeah, it's about twice this size, I remember it. But it's set up the same principle as this machine right here. We'd set up our ads, or we'd set up our letterheads, or whatever we were going to print. We'd set it up here on this, just like we did the newspaper. We'd take, the type and everything, we set it up here, run, some proofs of it, get it proofed by whoever was buying the material. Then we'd come over here, and the way this thing worked was you had this gear here, and this would be running, and you just throw it out of gear when you was getting everything set up. But the plate that you'd set up that you'd go and print was right in here. It was, inside there. And what would happen, we had rollers that went across here that you'd had ink that'd pick up off this plate. You'd keep this plate, covered with ink. And it'd come back up here and it'd pick up the ink. These jaws here would open up, and when they open up, the rollers would go down across the type and would ink the type. Well, while that was low, you had a couple of seconds to reach in here with the one you put in before, the envelopes, which were here, were the hardest because they were small and they're hard to grip, and they weren't just flat. So a lot of room for error here. But you had to get the next page positioned just exactly right when you put it in there, or it would, you had a real problem. So what you do, you pick up your paper here, you put it in, you get it against you'd pull out first with your left hand, you'd pull out the paper that just printed, set it here, or envelope, and then at the same time you'd be picking this up and putting it down, and you just had a few seconds before it made its revolution, and the press shut. And you get tired, and it was really important to be efficient because paper was expensive. And you did not want to lose paper, or have to reprint anything. So it was really, they didn't want you to mess up. And so when you'd get tired and you'd be doing this for hours, and then if you just weren't really careful and just really force yourself, you'd say, oh, I need to let that go. But then you'd think, but I'm going to get chewed out because there's going to be an envelope sitting over here on the floor that I ruined. And that's where you really could run into mistakes because you try to make sure that last, you got that last thing positioned just right so you didn't run it and you ruin your fingers. And a lot there's a lot of stories and a lot of, on the online, you can go and find out, a lot of people lost their fingers on this. But anyway, that's pretty well my thing. I think it's real interesting to see, let them talk about how they print the paper today versus how it was back then. But that's pretty well, that's what went on in here. There was, you know, you ask about ventilation and all. Over here was the only ventilation I can remember here, and I'm not absolutely certain about this, but as I remember right, you know, the lead pipe that we used up there in the lead blocks, we'd come back here sometime and just like we used to do gold in dental office, you know, we'd come back here and we had a big heavy pot there, and we'd melt it down and skim the impurities off, and that's, you know, we had a pot down here where we keep our you know, because if you had any impurities in that lead, it'd make defects in the type, and you couldn't see those defects, you know, but you get printed out, and then right all of a sudden you got a series of defects because you had bad lead, and then you're starting over, you know. So it's a really precise process that had to go on, and then when we go back, I don't know how many of y'all felt how rough that type was. We'd come in here and up there we'd lay the pages back out when we got through printing everything, and I'd sit there, and this is one job that they let the printers devil in, only the printers devil do, because when you graduated out of that job, you were really glad, because you took kerosene and a rag and you washed all that type loose so you get the impurities off you, because you got to recycle everything. So you wash it down, and it had to be just clean. You wash it down with kerosene, and rubbing that thing with kerosene with a rag, your knuckles were just scraped bare all the time. You could try to wear gloves, but you're just going to run through the gloves. So, you know, that's the dirtiest job, but that's what you did immediately after the paper was printed. That'd be the first thing I'd do when I'd come in on Wednesday afternoon. I'd take that down, I'd clean everything, and then I had to break down all the ads and go put all the type and all the headlines, you know, like a headline like the stone and this headline here. This might be, you know, done on the linotype, but you only had one size of linotype, you know, that we work with here. So I'd have to go in, you know, and we'd build all the headlines. I'd build all the headlines on the articles, and then, you know, you take those each letter and all the spaces in between, you'd have to refile them in the right place, you know, so you could reuse them and start all over again. So you had to break it down. It took me all Wednesday usually to get the paper broke down and all the print put back, you know, the letters put back in the right spot, the type put back in the right spot, start all over again. So if we want to move in where it's a little colder, and I think they'd really like to hear how y'all put the paper together today.
Now, after you cleaned your little top off, did y'all separate out the little pieces of top? Like, did you put your P's back in your P box, your Q's back in your Q box?
And every type C had a different size, and you had to know what size that was and what case it went in, because the worst thing you do. So it's a big learning process. Right. But they would give me, after a little while, they gave, you know, very good education process. But when we were setting it up, whether it's Benny or whether it's me, we could pick what case we wanted to use that we thought would catch the attention, you know, and we'd use the case, but we'd also have to know all the cases, so we knew what we was going to pick. And we use Gothic more than anything else, but we used everything you use on your computer today.
The same thing as fonts.
Yeah, the fonts, you know, but the cases, you know, but you'd have different size too within that. So you pull out a Gothic 12 and, you know, or 6, you'd have to pull out, you know, and you'd have to go back into the right drawer, because you mix cases, there's no way at all you could ever get it done. It'd just be, that was one thing you just couldn't do. You couldn't mess up, and because you just never could get it. I mean, it'd take forever sitting there reading a little old letter backwards and trying to read the size of it. You just it had to go back in the right slot.
Is that where they came up with the phrase, mind your P's and Q's?
That's right.
Well, I don't know, but it fits.
Oh, I was gonna ask if you could explain about letting, what letting means? You know, the line, the space between the lines, that there's a term letting you use on computers now, but didn't that come from the printing?
Yeah, and what it means was, what we did, you never could print anything that fit. See, I wish we don't have any of those frames, those,
Well, I've got some, but they're over at Clyde.
yeah.
You're talking about for the letterpress?
Well, for any of them, you know,
Yeah, I've got some.
Becky said she has one, she's pretty.
and we had, inside of it, it had springs that was attached to other strips of metal. And so what we'd do, we'd set up a page and we'd set wood blocks here, and when we got ready to tighten it down, we would tighten those screws until it pushed everything together. Well, you had very little tolerance in there. You had to have all your pages set up very flush. You couldn't have this column of print be a little bit shorter than this column of print, because if you did, when you picked it up, you're going to lose everything, because you had because you had a flat strips across here, you're going to lose all your paper and all your print. And like I dumped one in the floor right there, and you'd had to start all over, you know. So so what you do, you use those lines or spacers to put in there and make sure you got everything tight. So back then, if you read a column, it wasn't a perfect column, space column, if you looked at it close. That had little differences where I'd have to insert spaces in there where you didn't need, or we'd have to go back and rewrite. It was easier to put spaces in sometimes, but sometimes you got it where you didn't have enough room, and then you'd have to edit, you know, take something out. But most time we just put, within 8 pages, I could find a room for almost everything that went on there, in there. But then you'd tighten it up by just putting those lines, those space lines, and there were little metal space lines. Some we may have some over there that are real thin.
Yeah, there is.
No.
Oh, yeah, I see. Uh-huh.
Yeah. See, I mean, that's.
Yeah.
I'd slide spaces in between there, spacers. You know, in between there to tighten everything up.
Yeah, and they were made out of lead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, would somebody like to tell everyone about these pages here and these old reviews?
Go, Rusty.
These were actually, we send all of our newspapers down to Texas Tech. In the entryway, he's actually brought us some little cards that has the website on there to where you can go in and look at past copies of the Cross Plains Review. Some of those past copies have some of Robert E. Howard's writings. They brought those down today. The ones that are sitting here are pertaining to Robert E. Howard, his death, or his writings. They've all got something to do with Robert E. Howard. This particular one in the middle has Robert E. Howard's obituary. This is the original one that was printed in 1936. This is the original paper. This one right here was the death notice right before the obituary. It's just where they had found out what had happened, so they put in a little bit of a death notice here. This one right here was an actual writing of Robert E. Howard. You know, Robert E. Howard worked here for a short time, and he was paid $5 per column. So this particular, when I looked at this one and I saw it, I thought, wow, he made some money on that one for that day and time. This piece right here has Robert E. Howard's poem that you see also over at the Robert E. Howard house. But it's the one where it was one of the last poems that he had wrote. And he actually had the father came into the review, the story goes, and asked for it not to be printed. And then you see in the papers a couple of months, wasn't it, Terry?
It's the next month.
The next month, it appears in the newspaper. So apparently, you know, the news was the news, and that's kind of the way that it is today. If someone asks us not to print something, we have to make a judgment call, because we are You know, we are the news, so if it's in public interest, you know, we may reword it a little bit, but eventually it's gonna get out there because it's the news. That's what we do. We print the news.